Welcome back. I'm Stacey Delikat. If you're just joining us, there's a brief sidebar going on in the Jacksonville, Florida courtroom where two men are on trial for the tragic murder of a 22-year-old boy, Aiden McClendon, back in January of 2016. Those two defendants, Kwame Richardson and Henry Hayes. The allegation here, what prosecutors are trying to prove, is that the two men shot baby Aiden as he was sitting in his grandmother's car in their driveway. The prosecutors say the intended target was little Aiden's uncle. Right now, we are hearing from a detective on the stand who is a computer forensics expert, and he is testifying about some of the items found on one of the defendants' phone. In the days after this tragic murder, one of the defendants' phones showed a number of news searches, articles about this shooting. In addition, we just saw that one of the phones had a picture of Aiden on it. I do have a guest with me now who is going to help sort of break down what has been going on today so far in this trial and where we go from here. So Joseph Morgan is joining me via Skype, our forensics expert. Thanks for being with us today, Joseph.
Hey, thanks for having me, Stacey.
So what we're hearing now is a lot of nitty-gritty. We're hearing the detective sort of read off some instant messages, some text messages that are hard to decipher. But what is the significance of all of this? I mean, clearly there is some significance to the fact that one of the defendants was doing news searches on this the day after the shooting.
Yeah, and it kind of paints it into a harsh reality, doesn't it, relative to what these fellows were doing, their perception of what was going on at the time. And digital forensics is key, particularly in the world that we live in nowadays, because when you have this device in someone's hand, they're going back and searching these things, and it gives a timestamp. And these things that we talk about in forensics, particularly in the construct of connectivity, creating a timeline. In the past, we would, in the analog days, you know, it would be difficult to create a timeline, but now, with what we understand about digital forensics, it makes it a lot simpler, doesn't it? Where we can kind of measure these things along the way. And it is compelling evidence, I think, for the jury to hear, as long as they keep it simple and allow the jury to follow along. They don't get caught up in some kind of technical discourse here, because that'll put the jury off. But if you can follow the breadcrumbs, and if the prosecutor does a good job with this, you can show connectivity and interest.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the difficulties a lot of prosecutors have when it comes to going through cell phone evidence, which has become such a big part in so many cases, is it's really easy to get lost in the minutia and confused about text messages and the time this was sent and the search of this. Clearly, the fact that the defendant had the child's photo on his phone, that is something compelling, though, and clearly they were aware that there was a lot of attention on this, and likely feeling, we can only imagine, but pretty upset that they got the wrong target, and a child no less. Whether or not, you know, these are violent gang members, as prosecutors are seeking to show, it is frowned upon in gangs when the gang members get the wrong person. Let's go back into the courtroom now, where the testimony continues, and we'll be back to analyze in a moment. Okay, welcome back. Joseph Morgan still with me, our forensics investigative expert. And Joseph, right before we went back into the courtroom, we were talking about this expert on the stand, Detective Lombardozzi, who is a computer forensics expert with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. And we were talking about the fact that prosecutors presented a photo that was found on one of the defendant's phones, on Henry Hayes' phone, of little Aiden McClendon. Clearly, the fact that he had this toddler's phone suggests this child was on his mind, and they were aware of the mounting attention on this case, I would imagine.
Yeah, it would, and I think that a prosecutor worth their salt would be able to point that out and direct the jury in that manner. The trick is the defense going to be able to, you know, kind of counterattack here relative to what the prosecution is getting at? It's compelling to me, just as a peripheral watching this, that they have this connection where these people that are alleged to have perpetrated this poor little child's death are actually looking at the image just within days after this child's life has come to a violent end. So yeah, it gives us an indication that that they are thinking about, they're contemplating, and I think that the prosecution can speculate, well, why would they have this child's image on their phone? Are they interested in the safety of their community? Are they interested in this child? Did they know the child? What's the connection between the child and the family and these alleged perpetrators? And there's a whole case that can simply be based from this. So again, going back to the digital evidence, I think that it's quite compelling, Stacey.
Joseph, we're going to go back into the courtroom right now because the state has just called their next witness, and then we'll come back out and talk some more.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, if you're just joining us, we were just listening to testimony from Richard Kosick. He is with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office, works in the crime lab, and supervises the lab and fingerprints. He was just talking to us about the process of collecting fingerprints and determining whether or not those have value or not. This is in the trial of the murder of little Aiden McClendon, the 22-month-old boy who was tragically shot in a drive-by shooting. He was in his grandmother's car sitting in the driveway when prosecutors alleged that Kwame Richardson and Henry Hayes drove by, began firing. The intended target, they say, was the little boy's cousin. Now, we have heard a number of forensic details today about this case, and I have Joseph Morgan joining me via Skype. He is a forensics expert. He is actually joining us from Jacksonville. Is that right, Joseph?
Yeah, actually, Jacksonville, Alabama. I work at Jacksonville State University, where I'm a professor of forensic science.
Okay, this is what happens, you know, when you're up here in New York. So I took a quick glance, but that's good to know, because I was going to ask you what.
People make that mistake frequently. That's
yes.
Okay.
You know, so many forensic details, and while some of these may be a little bit dull, whether it's the phone records or the collection of the prints, ultimately these are the details that really matter in a case like this and in proving a murder without reasonable doubt, right?
Yeah, it is. And Stacey, as you well know, you watch popular media, everything. People want to hear the forensics. They want to hear the science behind a lot of this. And one of the things that I teach my students, going back to what this gentleman said on the stand, is that, as you notice, he said that there was an absence of a print. You know, in this world, we often think that I have to have positive findings for everything. Well, in a criminal investigation or any type of investigation, negative findings are just as significant as positive findings. So that'll, from an investigative perspective, as we're following the course of this thing, that'll put us on a particular path. Now, won't it? If there's an absence of something, and clearly they were attempting to demonstrate whether someone was present at a location where they had an off opportunity to touch a surface and leave behind what's referred to as a latent print. The gentleman went into great description talking about the difference between inked prints, which are left behind by the friction ridges on our hands. Let's keep in mind, for everybody watching at home, we don't have fingerprints on the tips of our fingers. We have friction ridges. The friction ridges actually leave behind fingerprints, which are transferred through fatty lipids, where our skin gets oily. And so when we contact these surfaces, one of the reasons the prosecutor was asking him about what's the best surface to get a print off of, he talked about shiny metal and glass and all these sorts of things. And that's because these are non-porous surface. So if you're a crime scene guy and you're looking for latent prints, you don't want to look at paper or wood. The ideal spot is going to be a non-porous surface like a glass, a computer screen, or even stainless steel or something. So that's one of the things that they're getting at. Connectivity, contact, point of contact, and the fact that an individual is in a room where they can contact this area gives us an indication that they were physically there, because our fingerprints are, in fact, unique to us. Not quite as unique as DNA, but still very, very unique, and that's a significant tieback.
Although, as we heard the expert on the stand say, just, a person's fingers won't always leave a print depending on the environmental circumstances, depending on humidity, extreme temperatures, whether there's a lot of debris. And I imagine that's the point prosecutors wanted to come out here. Just because that prints were not found does not mean that person did not have their hands on an item or surface.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Stacey. And so environmental conditions do play a big role. I know I was just up in New York last week. It was very hot up there and very sticky. Here in Alabama, trust me, it's very hot, very sticky right now. And so these environmental conditions play big into whether or not this trace evidence as it is going to degrade in any way, and it can be quickly lost. Let's also don't forget that people that come in contact, and I'm even talking about the police, they're not doing it in a nefarious manner. But if you don't take care at a scene, you can destroy a latent print just by simply brushing against it. They're very, very fragile things.
That is good to know, because a lot of people watch crime shows. We watch CSI, NCIS. You think, oh, someone touched something, there's a print, it's easy to pick up. But as we just heard from you and the expert on the stand, it really is a very, very complex process. Okay, we are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to switch gears for a moment. One of the things that Joseph is an expert in is mass shooting investigations, and I want to talk about that mass shooting out of Annapolis, Maryland, at the newspaper offices yesterday, which left 5 people dead. We'll take a quick break first. Stay with us.
Hey, everyone.
Thanks for that, Anthony. I am joined by Joseph Morgan, a forensic death investigator. He is joining us from Jacksonville, Alabama. Joseph, I want to get right to the shooting in Annapolis, Maryland, at the offices of the Capital Gazette newspaper yesterday. 5 newspaper staffers shot dead. The suspect, Gerard Ramos, a 38-year-old who clearly had a grudge against this paper. Here is what we know. We know that in 2012, Ramos sued the newspaper for defamation. There had been a column written about a criminal case against him, a case involving some online harassment. He was convicted in this case for harassing a woman via Facebook, telling her to kill herself, all kinds of threats, not staying away from her. He was upset that a columnist had written about this story in the context of online harassment, and he clearly could not get over him. And a judge tossed that defamation suit in 2012, saying there were no lies in it, so it wasn't defamation. It was from public record. But it seems from what we're learning over the past 6 years, this guy couldn't get over it. He had formed all sorts of social media accounts, angry at the newspaper, angry at the columnist who had written this about him. This is still a very active investigation. I mean, basically, we are just a little bit over 24 hours from when this happened. We know the scene had been secured yesterday, but Joseph, tell me, in your experience, what is going on right now on the scene of those newspaper offices as they try to process this scene? What is happening with this investigation today?
Yeah, the key here is detail, Stacey. I started my career with a coroner's office in New Orleans and finished up with the medical examiner in Atlanta, and over the course of my career worked any number of mass shootings. The problem is that when you walk into one of these things, it's mass chaos. There's potential evidence lying all about the place. This guy allegedly walked into the newspaper wielding a shotgun. Now, if he was firing the type of ammunition that I suspect he was, which probably was something like buckshot, which are essentially about 32 caliber balls.
Joseph, I have to interrupt you 1 second. There's so much to talk about this case, but we do have a verdict in the other big trial we have been covering out of Wisconsin. That is the beach murder trial, Daniel Tate. Let us go live there now to Wisconsin and see what jurors have decided about his fate. Welcome back to Law&Crime Trial Network. I'm Stacey Delikat. We are following some developments out of a Wisconsin courtroom where a jury may have a verdict. I want to correct some earlier reporting there. We had heard the verdict may be in, but we are unsure whether or not jurors just have some questions or whether, in fact, they have reached a verdict. Now, they have only been deliberating several hours in this murder case against 20-year-old Daniel Tate, who is accused of murdering 17-year-old Olivia McKay, a woman he met online, then arranged to meet for a date. The allegation here, he brought a friend along. When the friend wasn't looking, he put Olivia McKay in a chokehold, choked her, strangled her, pushed her head down into the water, killed her, then asked his friend, Damari Cook, to help ditch the body. We are monitoring what is going on in the courtroom right now to see whether or not jurors have questions or whether they may have reached a verdict. I have Joseph Morgan live with me via Skype. He is a forensics investigative expert. Joseph, this case, you know, like any murder, it is upsetting, but a lot of the signs certainly seem to point to Daniel Tate. As I mentioned a few moments ago, the defense's strategy here was to try to say, well, maybe it wasn't Mr. Tate, maybe it was his friend, Damari Cook, who was with him all along, because Damari Cook has been such an unreliable witness and changed his story. What do you make of this, and what do you think the jury is considering right now?
I think that probably the fact that this fellow had a girlfriend that was pregnant already, I think that they would kind of scratch their head and say, well, why in the world would he randomly go online and find a young lady to meet with, and why would he bring his friend along with him to have a day at the beach, as was stated?
Right.
That would leave me kind of scratching my head about in this particular case. What was his reasoning for this? And then we have the physical tiebacks. This perpetration of a heinous crime. It doesn't sound like it was very well planned, but he specifically attempted, or did, according to the prosecution, choke this girl out and place her into the trunk of the car. This is a heinous crime, Stacey. And then he wanted his buddy to help him dispose of the remains. So whether or not the witness was reliable or not, you've got some pretty significant graphic connectivity here.
Yeah, that is Daniel Tate, who we just saw being brought into the courtroom. And I just want to confirm now, we have heard definitively that the jury does have a verdict in this case. Joseph, some other testimony that came up in this case, jurors heard from former girlfriends who said that Daniel Tate tried to choke them during sex. Is that, you know, what it either tried to or did choke them during sex? What does this say to jurors?
Well, I think that it would show a pattern going back some time, that he is not averse to placing his hands on someone in a very aggressive manner. So this is apparently his go-to thing that he has. Only this time it ended up fatally with this poor young lady. And it's something that he wants to have power and control in. My suspicion is that if he did in fact choke this girl out and kill her, there would have been very specific findings that the medical examiner could have portrayed rather graphically in court to paint the picture of what happened at that particular time.
You know, and the fact that he did or tried to choke other girlfriends during sex certainly does show a pattern in his behavior. But to your point earlier, there are so many questions about this case. Why did he bring a friend when he lured this woman to the beach? And prosecutors alleging that this was all about stealing her car to get some money. Let's go live into the courtroom now, and let's see if the jurors are ready to read their verdict. Well, there you have it. We just heard the jury deliver a guilty verdict. Guilty for first-degree homicide, guilty for hiding a corpse, and guilty for taking and driving a vehicle without consent. Again, 20-year-old Daniel Cook found guilty of the murder of 17-year-old Olivia McKay back in July of 2017, a woman whom he met online, then lured to a beach along with his friend, then killed her, took her body in the trunk, and ditched it. Joseph Morgan is still with me via Skype, our forensics investigative expert. Joseph, we were just sort of predicting the verdict before it came in. You had sort of leaned this way, that it would be guilty because of some of forensic evidence. But talking about just patterns with criminals, you know, what we were just talking about before the verdict was read was that the allegation here was that this was done so he could steal her car. And we know that after the murder, he did try very aggressively to sell that car for just $500. What makes a person who we know has maybe choked women or tried to choke women during sex before, but as far as we know doesn't have too much else of a violent history, at least convictions for violence, what makes a person kill someone to take the car to sell it for $500? I mean, certainly there could have been other measures to try to steal something and get some money.
Yeah, I would think so, or maybe a job. I don't know, but I think that one of the things here is that maybe the reason they put forth this whole idea about stealing and selling the car, which he, as you stated, he did attempt to do for $500. Maybe this was in some way an attempt on the defense's part to try to soften this. That when you all boil it down, just as you had effectively mentioned a moment ago, that he had a history, some histrionics here going on with choking women as an adjunct to sex. Maybe his specific intent was to go out there and actually choke her out and have sex with her. And it just so happens that the car is just kind of a defensive, convenient defensive posture in this particular case. You can't change the stripes on a tiger. And if he in fact has a history of this, it's very, very chilling, particularly when you consider these other women that he's left in his wake. And I tell you something else, that if I were an investigator involved in this, that I would want to be looking into very carefully. I want to see if there were any other cases that have been left open that are out there, because we've already got this idea floating about that there is an established pattern with this young man. And granted, he is young, but this is something he's been practiced at, apparently. So I'd want to know if there are any other assaults out there, or if there have been other people, other young ladies that have been found deceased that have injuries to their necks.
Well, that will certainly be some interesting information to find out. Again, a jury just convicting 20-year-old Daniel Tate of first-degree murder for killing Olivia McKay, a 17-year-old woman, back in July of 2017. The jury also finding him guilty on the charges of hiding a corpse and taking and driving a vehicle without consent. We are going to take a quick break. When we come back, we are going to resume our conversation about the tragic mass shooting out of Annapolis, Maryland yesterday in the offices of the Capital Gazette newspaper. Stay with us. Welcome back. I'm Stacey Delikat. We have been watching live testimony out of Jacksonville, Florida. We are hearing from a DNA analysis expert who tested for DNA in this case. This is the murder case of 22-year-old Aiden McClendon, the toddler, murdered in a drive-by shooting as he sat in his grandmother's car in the driveway. The two men on trial for this crime, facing the murder charges, are Kwame Richardson and Henry Hayes. The allegation here is that the baby was the unintended target. They were out to get the baby's cousin. I have Joseph Morgan joining me via Skype right now out of Jacksonville, Alabama, and Joseph is a forensics expert. So, Joseph, we are hearing this expert right now on the stand, Jenilyn Adana, and what we're hearing is that they tested many different surfaces for DNA. So far from what we heard, she was not able to interpret any of the DNA that was found, or did not find any DNA at all. So we haven't heard much yet, but talk to me a little bit about this process of obtaining touch DNA, and would there be any DNA on any casings from the gun or any fragments from the gun?
Yeah, I think that it's important for the viewers to understand exactly what touch DNA is. When you think about day in and day out daily life, when we lose skin cells, which we do, thousands of them per day, each one of the skin cells contains a tiny fragmented piece of our DNA. That's what she was talking about with utilizing this fragmented DNA. What's key here is that what's going to be survivable. I tell students many times, if they want to think about touch DNA almost like talcum powder, only tinier, put a bit in your hand, blow on it, you'll see how delicate it is. It's easy to lose. Now, you combine this, remember they were talking about shell casings here, and this is key. With shell casings, what happens is that what they're trying to prove is that the individual had the shell casing or had the bullet in their hand, placed it into the magazine, and the DNA transferred. The DNA very well may have been there before the weapon was fired. But the intense heat that occurs within that chamber at the moment that firing pin initiates that sequence is so much that it will destroy any of the touch DNA there. That's why she's not finding any of it. And as she said in her statements, this is consistent with all of the other cases that she has worked. Why
bother asking her then about all of this testing she did, if it's not common to find DNA on surfaces like this anyway, on casings or on fragments from the gun? Why bother even questioning about it on the stand?
Well, I think that it's key because, you know, the defense will bring it up. If they don't say it, and this is what will happen, this goes to the issue of reasonable doubt, they'll begin to talk about, oh, well, you didn't test for DNA. And remember what we said earlier in our conversation, Stacey, the jury wants to hear about forensics. Well, in this case, they're going to want to hear about DNA. And as I'd stated earlier, negative findings are just as important as positive findings. So in this particular case, you want to state that you, as a forensic scientist, have done your due diligence. You've checked this out. You have, and then she's able to explain why it's not there, and that's a key point, because you begin to talk about the dynamic. Now you're talking about firing the weapon. Oh, the reason their DNA wasn't there is that they fired this weapon at some point in time, and the DNA degraded or disappeared as a result of this intense heat. So it's important. The jury wants to hear it. The court wants to hear it, and the defense, I think. It kind of knocks one of the legs off of their stool, because if the defense has the door open for them and they're able to question her and say, well, why didn't you test for it? That makes her look like she's faulty in her practice.
Good point. So we are seeing that at least she did do some very comprehensive testing here. Joseph,
Yes,
thanks for explaining that. Let's go back live now into the courtroom and hear the continued questioning of this DNA analysis expert. I'm Stacey Delikat. If you're just joining us, we have been watching live testimony out of a Jacksonville, Florida courtroom where two men are on trial for murdering 22-year-old Aiden McClendon, the toddler, in his grandmother's car when these two men allegedly drove up, began shooting the little boy, the unintended target. Prosecutors say the two suspects were gang members and they were trying to get little Aiden's cousin. Joseph Morgan is with me live via Skype. He is in Jacksonville, Alabama, not to be confused with Jacksonville, Florida. And Joseph is a forensics expert. Joseph, we have been hearing from this witness, Jonalyn Adana, who's a forensic DNA analyst. Just a few minutes ago, you explained why it's not uncommon for there not to be DNA, touch DNA on things like shell casings or other fragments from a firearm. But now we are hearing about some positive DNA matches she was able to make, including on, for example, the interior driver door of the car in question. She testified that she was able to positively match the DNA with one of the suspects, Kwame Richardson, right? This doesn't tell us that he fired the gun, but perhaps more strongly supports that he was in the vehicle in question at the time.
Right, and that's key. And they began to talk about the commingling of these samples that are there, but he is the one that fits the profile. So the likelihood of it being anyone else, remember, she started talking about statistical analyses and how many people are on Earth. And so you begin to compare that with what the probability is here. And the numbers, you know, for normal folks get to be staggering. But in her world, it puts a very fine point on it, doesn't it? So, yeah, this is a strong indicator that he was, in fact, there. You're right. It doesn't give us any indication as to whether or not he fired the weapon. It's just a physical placement. And again, they're building a case. They're building a case here, and that lends more solidity to this.
Joseph, thanks for that. Let's go back live inside the courtroom right now as the cross-examination of this witness continues. Okay, that witness, Jonalyn Adana, a forensic DNA expert out of Jacksonville, Florida, has just stepped down. The state now calling their next witness. Again, if you're just joining us, this is live courtroom testimony out of Jacksonville, Florida. This is the murder trial of two defendants, Kwame Richardson and Henry Hayes. They are both charged with murdering 22-year-old Aiden McClendon, the little toddler, sitting in his grandmother's car in the driveway when these two men allegedly drove by, opened fire, and little Aiden was struck several times by bullets. He later died at the hospital. Now, prosecutors say the men's intended target was Aiden McClendon's cousin. The allegation here that these two men are gang members with a violent history. And this is a bit of a complex trial in that there are two separate juries for each of the two defendants. So at different times, both juries are in. Sometimes the judge just brings one jury in or the other. Joseph Morgan, a forensic death investigator, still with me right now, joining us via Skype from Jacksonville, Alabama. So we just heard this DNA expert talk about the positive identification she was able to make of DNA found on the interior door handle of the car in question here. And Joseph, you just told us, yes, while that doesn't say that Kwame Richardson or Henry Hayes did it, it does more definitively place them in this vehicle that was alleged to have been involved in the crime. There was a question about transference DNA. Joseph, for those who don't know, because I wasn't too familiar with that concept, explain transference DNA and how that works.
Well, it's easy to transfer. As I mentioned earlier, we lose skin cells daily by the thousands. So these things can, in fact, be transferred. You can transfer from one surface to the other. Also, you can get a transference per cross-contamination, say, of commingling of blood samples, seminal samples, any number of other areas. So I think that a lot of folks, they kind of rest in their understanding of this, that it's a fail-safe kind of science, and it's not. As a matter of fact, it's very fragile and very, very delicate, tough to work with, and you have to know what you're doing. Reflect back to what she said earlier in her testimony, going specifically to the area where she's talking about procedure. Did you notice how she was talking about she changes her gloves and her hair coverings very, very frequently? Well, one of the reasons this comes up is the idea that you can transfer even the technicians on DNA. Not to go off the rails too far here, but let's reflect back to the recent comments that have been made about Jean Bonnet in the last few years. One of the things talking about that child's underwear was that perhaps where the underwear was packaged in Malaysia, you could have gotten DNA sample that transferred all the way there through the packaging and remained present on her underwear in that. So we begin to think about these very complex ideas as it refers to DNA, and you have evidence of it being fragile, but then again you have it being resilient, where it'll hang in, and just the off chance that a DNA analyst happens to recover some of this on a swab at a scene, you never know what you're going to come up with. Remember, none of this stuff is visible. It's kind of a shot in the dark when they test these particular areas and they're running that swab over that suspected area. Places like door handles, door latches, mirrors, steering wheels, all this sort of thing.
Yeah, Joseph, I do think that's a very good point, that even though we hear a lot on crime TV shows, read about DNA, a lot of people think, oh, there's DNA that ties a person. It is not as straightforward. It is a very intricate science. Let's go back now into the courtroom where the state has called its next witness. Okay, we've been listening to live testimony out of Jacksonville, Florida. That is Rachel Offelin, a DNA analyst on the stand, who has been describing some of the DNA that was found and tested on guns and casings from the scene of this shooting. 22-year-old Aiden McClendon, the toddler shot dead by the two men, allegedly by the two men on trial. I want to let you know we are going to continue to stream live coverage on this trial, lawandcrime.com, so you can continue to watch the rest of the day's court proceedings over there. But before we go, we want to recap where we are in this case. So let's go to that recap right now.
This week, Law & Crime will take you inside the trial of two 19-year-olds charged with murdering a toddler in Jacksonville, Florida. 22-month-old Aiden McClendon was the unintended victim of a shooting. The little boy was sitting in a car outside his family home with his mother and grandmother when gunshots pelted the vehicle. Aiden was hit at least 3 times and died. The drive-by shooting has been linked to gang activity, and authorities believe the intended victim of the crossfire was Aiden's cousin, who was outside the house when the incident occurred. Police say a rap video sparked the violence that caused the shooting. Many of the witnesses are known gang members. The defense will likely attack their credibility. Henry Hayes and Kwame Richardson have been charged with murder, attempted murder, and shooting into a vehicle for the crime. For Law & Crime, I'm Rachel Stockman.
Thanks for that explainer, Rachel, about the case against Kwame Richardson and Henry Hayes, which does continue at this moment out of Jacksonville, Florida. Head over to our website, lawandcrime.com, where you can click to watch the live feed to watch the rest of today's testimony. Before we sign off, though, today, I want to bring back my expert, Joseph Morgan, who's with me from Jacksonville, Alabama. Joseph is an expert on mass shootings. Earlier, we started talking about yesterday's big news, the mass shooting out of Annapolis, Maryland, where 5 people were shot dead in the offices of the Capital Gazette newspaper. Police say the suspect, Gerard Ramos, a 38-year-old man who had a serious grudge against this newspaper. He was upset over a column about him, which was written in 2011. That column detailed a criminal case against him for online harassment via social media. Joseph, I asked you before, and you were starting to talk about sort of what's going on the ground today with this investigation, because while we are now more than 24 hours from the shooting, there are still a lot of pieces to put together.
Yeah, let's keep in mind that this individual did not end their life after they've perpetrated this or allegedly perpetrated it, this horrible crime. They're still alive. So this is going to be a prosecutable case. And I can tell you that they're going to follow through with this. And in order to do that, Stacey, they're going to have to collect and carefully collect every bit of evidence, and there is a myriad of it. When you walk into one of these just ghastly scenes, the thing that's so striking about it is the chaotic nature and trying to, and I often tell people, you're having to examine the abnormal in the context of the normal, this office area where people have gone under desk, things are turned over, you've got broken shards of glass, there's blood trails, spent casings from ammunition. So it's highly complicated. Remember, this is a dance of death that kind of went on as this gentleman walked through the office discharging this weapon. We understand that it was a shotgun that was utilized. You've got live rounds that are being discharged in this small, very small office space. People are being struck. And so he is moving around, so are the victims. And so you're going to have kind of cross patterns as you walk through this thing, and they have to take their time. I can assure you that right now, this whole thing is locked down. You have not just members of the local law enforcement agencies, but they're being aided also by the Maryland State Police, and probably ATF and FBI are out on the scene with their forensic response teams, giving them a hand, because this is so highly complicated. And you have to be very careful as to how many people you're going to allow onto the scene. One of the things that I've encountered in the past, when you walk onto one of these things and it's in the spotlight of the media like this is, you'll have a variety of different players that will want to take charge, everybody from the federal level, the state level, and the local level. Let's keep in mind, this is a local level homicide. The local level has to assert their authority, come in and manage the scene, and the FBI and everyone else there, they're there as guests of the local constabulary. So they have to come in and establish that first, who's in charge, and then methodically work their way through. They'll document it by not just collection of evidence, but photographically. Remember, we're talking about this going to trial. So the attorneys are going to have to paint a picture, and one of the best ways to do this is photographic evidence. This moment is literally frozen in time vis-a-vis these photographs and imagery, maybe videography that's going to be used, and it will slowly take the potential jury all on kind of a tour of what happened in this environment. And that's one of the things that we seek to do as scene investigators, is freeze those moments in time, collect the evidence appropriately so that we can go back and tell the tale of these people that have been so grievously injured, and obviously represent the families who have lost these loved ones.
Joseph, we only have a few more minutes. I just want to talk about a few other facts that have come to light today. Anne Arundel County Police, that is the local police agency you were referring to, who are heading up the investigation. They say that when they searched Ramos's home and vehicle, they did find evidence that clearly this was a plan, that he had made preparations for this. They didn't give any details, but in your experience, what might some of that evidence be? be? I mean, computer searches or stuff like that. I also want to mention the gun he had, the shotgun that you referenced, was apparently purchased legally last year. But in terms of evidence they may have found that suggests this was very much premeditated, what might that be?
Well, you know, I've also heard an indication that there were smoke grenades that had been found at one point in time. I haven't been able to validate that as of yet because it's so early. This does go to planning. I would imagine they're doing deep computer searches on his software that's been left behind to see what his you know, digital track is going back, the planning of this thing, anticipating police response times, all these sorts of things. And even I've seen cases like this where you got pre-planning. Well, they'll look at building schematics to try to understand this. He obviously had some familiarity with this organization prior to, because he had had some court dealings with them. So he's probably not unfamiliar with this building. And just the planning. If he's going to insert himself into this building, does he have a plan for escape? And also, what kinds of weapons is he choosing? Has he gone back and searched things like what's the most effective weapon in close quarters combat to do maximum amount of injury? That can go to the weapon itself. You mentioned the shotgun that had been purchased, as well as even the ammunition. You've got 3 types of ammunition with shotguns: birdshot, buckshot, and slug ammunition that are commonly found. So that's going to be key as well.
Yeah, all good points there, and all things that investigators will be looking at. Another interesting thing to point out is that Gerard Ramos, the officers found him hiding under the desk in the office, so he had actually stopped shooting on his own. I think that's an interesting point, which I wish, Joseph, that we could talk more about, but unfortunately we are out of time. So, Joseph Scott Morgan, thank you so much for being with us. Joseph is a distinguished scholar of applied forensics at Jacksonville State University. Thank you so much for all of your analysis today. Everyone, thanks for joining us. Have a great weekend. We'll see you back here on Monday morning.